Today's presentation is how to be a better presenter, not about how to do better presentations. That's a separate topic, and we can discuss that in a future date if you have questions about that. But I do want to help you all present better because we do a lot of presentations for clients. We do a lot of presentations between our peers, and it's especially important when you're doing it for stakeholders. So this is something that I thought was very important, and these are notes taken from just listening to a lot of people present, not just my team, but everyone overall at where we work at. So these are just different notes, different things that I've taken from a lot of places. So hopefully some of this is useful to you. So the number one thing, the most important thing of all to be a better presenter is to know your stuff. And that means that you have to know what you're talking about. You have to know the thing that you're talking about. It doesn't mean that you have to be an absolute master or an expert in everything, but it does help that you know what you're talking about. In the sense of if you're talking about a product, or in my case, for example, I'm explaining a design, I could just be talking out my butt and talking about like, oh, this is that and the other thing. But if I don't know the context, for example, I don't know the limitations, I don't know what the considerations were for how to present. If I don't know all these different things that I should be knowing before I open my mouth, that's going to make me look dumb, but that can also get me in trouble because I could be talking about things and then being corrected, or even just lead people in the wrong direction, basically. So this is very important that you know what you're talking about, that you have that at least enough, enough that you feel comfortable talking about it without needing like some script or needing, to reference a million things. So that's always important to know what you're talking about. And for those that, like me, like to improvise sometimes, it also helps with that kind of thing because it helps with nervousness, but it also helps with fluency because then you can talk about things in a natural way instead of being like, I'm going to read a script and you can tell that I'm reading from a script. So that's the thing that's going to help you the most, because when you're nervous, it's because you don't know something or you're unsure. So the more confidence you can build up with that knowledge, the better off you're going to be. Another important thing when you're starting is to set the stage, because you can put a lot of filler in presentation. You can put a lot of different things that will make it seem longer, or there could just be a lot of fluff. Basically, I'm just going to call it fluff for now, which means that you have to set the stage for yourself and for the people that are going to see the presentation. Which means, for example, the first thing is that context is key. And by that, I mean, if you have business requirements, product considerations, that kind of thing, like if you're presenting something, make sure that the people know those things, because not always everyone knows it. Like if you're talking to a stakeholder, he probably does know the business requirements. But if you're asking for feedback, for example, from your own team, they may not always be aware of those things. So that's always important that you have those requirements, because without the requirements, they might ask questions of like, oh, but why don't you do it this other way or this other way? And the requirements tend to narrow things down, because sometimes people think there's a common phrase of think outside the box, but design is actually really good at thinking inside the box, for example, because we get very creative when we're within a limitation. Because you could say to someone like, oh, paint whatever about whatever with whatever medium, but the really interesting pieces of work usually come out because there are requirements, there's limitations. You don't have infinite budgets, you don't have everything available at your fingertips. So it's like, well, I have these things, what can I do within that realm? And so having those requirements kind of makes that box apparent, so that people don't throw out all these wild ideas that could be good ideas in another context but don't even matter in this context. Always state what you want to accomplish. So for example, if I'm asking for feedback, I make it clear I want feedback. If you expect that, then let people know. But also, speaking of feedback, if you're expecting feedback, make sure you let them know what kind of feedback you want, because a lot of people could just say, oh, it looks good, it looks pretty, etc. But you might actually be like, no, I don't care if you think it's pretty or not. What I want is for you to tell me, does this solve X problem? Or in the context of what I just told you, which of these two is better? Or which of these solves the problem better? Or what flaws do you see in one or the other approach? Because then that helps you narrow things down. So knowing what you want to accomplish beforehand is very important, because I'm sure all of you have been in those meetings where even the person that started the meeting doesn't really know what they're getting at. Like they're just like, let's get together and talk. And then you're all kind of rambling and doing all these things. And at the end of it, you didn't really get much out of it. You just wasted a bunch of time and talked. It's because you didn't set the stage. You didn't set the context. Another important thing, just enough. Say just enough, which means you're not going to be telling your life story. You're not going to be explaining, oh, we tried all these billion things, but I only want you to focus on these two. Skip all those other things. They are irrelevant. They're relevant for when you're working on them, but they're not relevant for when you're asking for feedback. If you just want opinions between A and B, for example, you don't have to show C, D, E, and F and all the other things that were rejected, because that just adds noise and then it confuses people, and they might even end up wanting those other things. And especially for design, though I'm sure it happened to others, if you show a client something that's ugly, There's always a risk, and it happens more often than you think, that they're going to pick the ugly thing instead of the ones that are actually the better versions because you know that they're better. Another thing that's important is if they didn't ask, don't tell, which goes related to the don't show all these other things, but you can have them at the ready. So maybe you have an option C or D as like a plan B, but don't show them until someone asks. Or maybe someone complains, hey, but these things don't work. What about you try X or Y? And you're like, oh, actually, I do have those things. So now you bring them up. Because otherwise, you're just, like I said, you're just going to be adding noise. You're just going to make things more confusing instead of trying to keep it narrow, which is the point of a good presentation. You should just get to the point. The other thing is anticipate obvious questions. Because if you know that they're going to ask you about X or Y, you're like, I just know so-and-so is going to ask me about this or that. Bring it up so that they don't have to ask you that question, or so that they don't make it seem like, oh, well, you didn't consider this or that or the other thing, did you? If you bring it up, then that's going to be good. Obviously, you don't want to try to anticipate absolutely everything, because then that's just going to, again, lead you to ramble on. But the obvious things that they're going to ask you about, do make sure that you cover them. Do make sure that you're talking about them. One more important thing, which I think a lot of us forget, is set the meeting etiquette. Which means, for example, if you set the stage and you show all the things and here's the context, but now let me bring it back and ask you about these things one at a time. Like, let's focus on the UI and let's talk about the header bar, for example. Let's talk about this thing first. Give me feedback on these things. Now let's talk about this other thing. Now let's talk about the content or the text or the pop-up or whatever. So ask things one at a time, because sometimes there's presentations where you're like, you show everything and you're like, tell me what you think. And then people are lost because they don't know. Sometimes you don't focus them, so that means that they're just going to be like, well, it looks pretty, it looks nice, I like it. That doesn't help you at all. But when you're like, I have specific questions about these things, what do you think about this versus this, or what do you think about just this thing that I showed you, then that helps them to focus, and asking one question at a time gives you the feedback that you need. The other thing is, if for some reason you don't want questions or you don't want to be interrupted for a second, you can tell them, actually, let's leave questions at the end, or this is just a demo, so because of limited time, there won't be time for questions, that kind of thing. Depends on what you want. But again, you set the stage, and then you don't have to be interrupting people or seeming rude because you're cutting someone off because you have 10 minutes to present something, and just their question alone is going to take up like 3 or 4 minutes, which you don't have. And the other thing, which Kevin did a good demo of that just now earlier, was raise your hand. Almost all meetings apps have something like that, or literally the raise hand. That's something that you could ask people to do. If you have questions, for example, if you do expect interruptions or between topics, you're going to stop and let people ask your questions, then ask them, raise a hand so that I can see that there is a question. And if not, I'm just going to move on. That's a good way to prevent the awkward pauses where you're just kind of like, does anyone think anything? Does anyone agree, et cetera, et cetera? If you just ask them, like, raise a hand when you have, a question, then that's going to help. Obviously, it depends on the presentation, because there's other meetings that are more free flowing, or the raise hand is a little more awkward and people just blurt out the things that they need as you're going through feedback. But again, that's part of the whole set the stage concept. Make sure that people know what is expected. Is it just going to be free flowing? Are you going to expect people to raise hands, et cetera? Next important thing, slow down, which I'm at fault for not doing a lot of times, which means that you have to speak slower, because sometimes you want to speak fast because you want to get to the point, or because you have limited time, or because you have a lot to say. And so you have to, basically 2x speed yourself so that you can fit a half hour and 15 minutes. But the problem, especially related to number one, if you know your stuff, you can probably speak faster. But there's times when there's going to be lagoons, when there's going to be gaps. So slowing down, speaking slower, even though you want to go faster, is going to help you, because when you double down, when you go faster, all that's going to happen is you're going to get tongue-tied, you're going to mix things up, you're going to start speaking in error, or the other one that's very common is you're going to start using the vocal crutches, which you should avoid, which is funny because in Spanish, muletillas, it's the same word, right? Like we use the same term for the crutches, which means using so, like, well, right? Like all those things, you should delete them from your speech as much as possible, because it's something that becomes almost cartoonish when you start to notice that someone's always, well, like, and it's like, and then like, it's funny. So it's something that one good way to avoid, even though it's very uncomfortable, record yourself in a speech, or like if someone's already doing a thing and it's being recorded, listen to yourself and try to catch those things, especially with yourself, because we're our own worst critic. Like they're going to jump out at you like, oh, I say X or Y phrase too much, or I gesticulate too much with my hands, or I'm moving up and down all around, or I'm like crazy, doing something on the screen that's really annoying. All those things you should pay attention to, because next time you're presenting, then you start to become more aware of like, actually, you know what? I should probably not do that thing. Or you're about to say that word that you say all the time and you're like, just don't say it. When it comes to vocal crutches, my best advice is whenever you feel like an or an ah or whatever is about to come, just be quiet. Just stop. It's not awkward. There can be pauses. It's fine. That's actually a normal part of speech is to have pauses. So if you were about to say because again, going back to the lack of knowledge or not sure where you're going next or what is coming next out of your mouth because you're still formulating the thought, just put a pause in there. It's a lot more comfortable to just hear silence for a split second than to hear repeatedly. It's very annoying. So that's why next point, pauses are very important. Pause every few sentences to allow questions, but also give yourself time to catch up to your own mind because a lot of times your brain is going 1,000 miles an hour and your mouth just can't keep up, which is another reason why we tend to speak fast because you're trying to catch up. So if you make those pauses, even if it's just not even for questions, but just to pause to give yourself that time to, to use technical terms, for your brain to buffer and to say like, okay, wait, what are the next things that I'm going to say? That's a good way to prevent those vocal crutches. It's a good way to force yourself not to insert those crutches because you're like getting used to the pauses, getting used to just silence for a second. It's fine. It's not scary. It's like white space. It's fine. You don't need to fill everything with things. One other thing that's important when you're changing topics, it's good to make that pause again because sometimes some people is like slide 1, 2, 3, and there's like no break to get a word in. There's no break to even catch your own breath or to get your own thoughts in order. Or maybe you're processing something they said and they're already moving on to the next thing. And the last one, take a drink. That's the best way to force yourself to pause because you can't talk and do the other thing or you're going to choke. But it's a good way to introduce a break, but also, especially if you're going to be talking for a long time, keeps your throat moist and not, dry, and then you're going to be making weird noises and annoying people even further. Next thing that's important, be in control. My best advice is just do it, like the great Shia LaBeouf said, just do it, which means stop over apologizing. You're apologizing because, oh, sorry, or this thing or the other thing. Just stop. Just don't apologize. Apologize when you mess up big, but don't apologize all the time because that also becomes annoying. I know in a lot of us, that's something that we tend to do. We say like, oh, sorry about this, sorry about the other thing. But especially for presentations, over apologizing is very annoying. Stop. Because it also brings attention to all the errors. And the whole point is just get to the next thing. Or for example, going to the previous topic, if you get tongue-tied and you're tripping over yourself basically about what to say next, if you're saying sorry or oh, oops, or I meant this, or actually, those kinds of things, it's bringing attention to the mistake, but it's also cutting the flow. If you find yourself, that something is happening, then just keep going. So the other thing that's very important is perfectionism is your enemy because perfectionism is really just masked insecurity because there's a lot of people that boast about saying, oh, I'm a perfectionist. That just means that you're scared of failure and that means that you're probably not going to get a lot done. And I put myself in that camp because sometimes you just want everything to be perfect before you send it out. But that's the whole point. Like just send it out. That's the whole agile methodology is instead of trying to get it perfect the first time is iterate. Try it, see how well you need to adjust, what works, what doesn't, and then iterate again and again and again. That's a lot better than trying to just get it right the first time because nobody's perfect and nobody gets it right all the time the first time. The other thing that's important, control the flow. And by that, I mean multiple things. If someone is jumping ahead, like they want to ask you about something that's coming up, or even if yourself, you know that something else is coming up, either in your own case, if you're trying to jump ahead, if you can tie it together, that's great. If not, then stop. But if someone else is trying to jump ahead of your slides, for example, you know that you're going to cover something, let them know. Say like, oh yeah, I'm going to cover that in a second, but I'm going to finish this thought. So stop when people are trying to jump ahead because that can derail your conversation. It can derail your train of thought and it can also derail the flow. And also speaking of flow, if you practice, for example, and you notice that you want to jump from this topic to the next one, maybe that's a cue that you need to reshuffle things around. So something else important. If you find yourself jumping ahead of your own presentation, maybe the ordering needs to be changed. If people start going off topic, try to find the best way to bring it back. Sometimes you need to be very abrupt. You just literally need to like stop them and say like, okay, but let's get back on topic. Or, the more common one is, and that's our go-to in where we work is we say, let's take it offline, which is a nice way of saying be quiet and let's talk about something else, or let's just stop that and talk about something else. So when you're going off topic or if you're going around in circles talking about the same thing over and over again, let's take it offline is a good, it's your friend basically. Like remember that phrase, memorize it, use it all the time because that's very important. to basically look at things asynchronously. That's really what we mean by offline. Let's look at it in chat. Let me send you an email, or let's go one-on-one after the fact. Then let's us just discuss it instead of having everyone present and derailing the conversation. The most important one, if you find you're rambling on and going off and telling some weird story or trying to make a joke or trying to be funny or other things, and it's not really related, and especially if you got, short amount of time, just stop and move on. Just catch yourself and then either cut the story short or don't even go there, but move on, because that's the worst thing that you can do, is just ramble on and get people bored. And the other important thing about being in control is asking follow-up questions, especially, for example, if you're asking for feedback and someone said something interesting, or someone said something that like, oh, actually, why don't you try this other thing? Follow-up questions to that would also help you, because it's not just, oh, so-and-so said I should do it, so I'll just do it. If you ask some follow-up questions, you can actually get to the reason behind. They can give you a good reason. They can give you a terrible reason. But that can also help you assess, should I even listen to that bit of feedback? Does it come from an informed place, or is it just someone that says, oh, well, I like this other thing better, so why don't you try that? Follow-up questions can help you bring light to those things, and that'll help you make more informed decisions, because then you can be like, oh, that's actually a very good point. Let me try that. Or be like, that's actually not related at all. But obviously, you're not going to tell them that, that's a bad idea. You can just be like, okay, thank you. One very important thing about being nervous, which is a problem with almost everyone. And if you're not nervous, or at least a little bit nervous, that probably means you don't care. So you should maybe worry then. But if you're nervous, the most important thing you could do is be comfortable. Because the worst thing you can do is be uncomfortable. Like, you really have to pee and you forgot, or you're like dying of thirst, or your throat is all dry, or whatever the case may be. The more uncomfortable you are, the worse your nerves are going to get, because everything just amplifies when you're uncomfortable. The other thing that's very important, practice your presentation. Do a trial run with someone, sometimes within your own team. This is something that we do. For example, this show and tell that I'm giving to you right now was actually a smaller internal meeting that we did. So I did a beta version of this, if you will. And so I practice it. And that gives me a lot of valuable feedback on what I should change, what I need to add, what was good, what wasn't, what I might need to change or say differently. So that always helps. You don't always have that time, but when you do it, because it's going to help you, especially when it's a big stakes kind of meeting. That's especially when you want to practice, because you don't want to be nervous. You don't want to be forgetting the important things, but you also want to be sure that if you are going to forget those things, you put them somewhere in your presentation or in your notes or something, so that you don't mess those things up. Another thing that's very important is pronunciation, which is, especially for non-English speakers, non-native English speakers, is very tricky. So it happens a lot. You heard me earlier. I got my tongue tied. So what happens when there's words that you're not sure how to say? Google is a very good tool for those words, because you can look for the individual word and look for pronunciation. And for example, Google will give you, like, it'll even show you the mouth of like how you should move your mouth and how you should like say the word, and you can hear it. And you can even hear it between English in an American accent or British, because that's another thing that, depending on where you studied, some of us in Mexico learned like the more British English, which in spelling is more obvious when you spell color with a U, for example, instead of just without it. Those kinds of differences can also go to the words that we speak. And the more British that we speak, the weirder it's going to be. Like, if our clients are American and we're speaking with British words, sometimes it might be, cause a bit of a difference of, it's the same with Spanish. When you're speaking to someone from Mexico versus someone from Spain, there's a lot of words that we use very differently. So that's kind of like the same difference. So it's important, to check pronunciation, and it'll also help you so you can say those things a lot better. Because there's other things, which separate topic, but even things like the word focus, if you say it wrong, it sounds like a cuss word. So you don't want to be cussing, and you don't want to sound like you're cussing. So be sure to check those things out. The other important point is, if you're nervous, just spit it out. Just say the word. If you're like Porky Pig and you can't get the word out, find a different word and say it. Just like him, just do the Porky Pig, but say the word. If you're getting tongue-tied, if you're messing the word up, if you said it half wrong and then you try again, just say it. Like I said earlier, don't apologize. Just stop yourself, try again, but just get it out. Stop trying to be like getting all stressed out that you can't say the word or whatever, or even if it's wrong, just say it. People will most of the time understand what you mean, or if you're asking for, is it, the right way to say it, they can correct you. If you're between your own peers, just learn by actually doing instead of being afraid of saying the word. Next thing is just go with the flow, which means don't bring attention to errors, like I said before. And a good lesson in humility is think of yourself less. Not think less of yourself, but think of yourself less. Worry less about yourself. Oh, this, or what if I didn't do my hair right, or whatever. Doesn't matter. If you're doing the presentation, you're probably your own worst critic in the sense of you're going to be noticing all these things that a lot of other people don't. It's like parties. If you've ever hosted a party, most people will say, "Oh, the party was great," but you know all the things that went wrong, all the things that you messed up, all the things that you didn't do that you should have. Everyone thought it was a great party. Cool. That's the important part. Another thing that's very important: try to not attack your teammates. Friendly fire is one of the worst things you can do. Criticizing each other or being like, oh, like what they call throwing someone under the bus. Like, oh, actually, so and so did this thing, and oh, he messed up. No, especially when you're presenting as a team to someone else, you want to avoid all that infighting. If you're gonna have conversations about that stuff, do it beforehand. But especially with a stakeholder, you don't want to be showing that you're divided, but also you don't want to be causing dissent, because that's very dangerous, because it can derail everything. It can just be like, oh, well, you guys aren't sure, so let's actually not do any of this, or let's actually listen to someone else. So all of that is very important. And the last thing, stop taking things so personal. If someone corrects you, it's because they want to help. It's not because they want to humiliate you or whatever. Most of the time, especially like when it comes to like English words and pronunciation and all that stuff, just take it. Thank you. So, and this is related to not being angry all the time, which is why you need to practice another virtue, which is patience. Something that's very important, that happens to me a lot, is try to say things once and let it sit there. Because a lot of times you want to repeat yourself 2 or 3 times because you're like, it's because they don't understand, or they keep asking me about the same thing, so I'm just going to keep repeating myself. Just say it once and let it sit there. You don't have to repeat yourself all the time, because that also makes you seem stubborn, but that also derails the conversation, because like I said earlier, sometimes they want to go around in circles. So if you keep replying to the same thing, you're going to keep going in circles with them. So sometimes it's just get out of that circle. Let them keep going in that loop, but get out of it. Sometimes you just need to let other people talk. Sometimes they want to interrupt and you just want to double down and say the same thing over again, because you're like, no, you should have no comments. You should have no questions because I made it super clear. Just let them talk. Just let it be. Another tip is try not to sound confrontational. Instead of saying you're wrong, you say something like, have you thought about doing it this way? Or very important, for example, with design, when we have user research, if we have data, we can say like, actually, this thing is not a good idea because, and facts. Like if you spit out facts, you spit out data, that's going to knock down a lot of things down. So the more that you have on your side, that's going to help. Like, oh, I can't implement this thing because of this. If you know that for a fact, then that's good. That goes back to number one. If you know your stuff, you're going to be able to shoot down ideas that probably won't work. But if there's things where you're not sure of, then you can be like, okay, let me think about it, or we'll discuss it offline, or we'll think about it, or we'll do a proof of concept, whatever the case may be. The point is, try not to fight everything, because you can get mad. And if you find yourself getting mad, like I said, pauses are your friends, because that can give you a pause to breathe. So if you find yourself about to yell at someone, take a breath before you speak. Try to just relax, remember where you are, remember who you're talking to, and remember who's present, because sometimes we just see red and we go after that person. You don't always need to defend yourself, which is important. Sometimes some people will be attacking you or your ideas. Like I said earlier, don't take it personal, and you don't always need to defend yourself. If it's a really big charge, then yeah, sure, defend yourself. But sometimes you could just let it slide and nothing bad's going to happen. So, you know, you don't always have to be on the defensive, because that also leads to being angry. And the other important part is don't interrupt, because it happens a lot, especially when voices start getting raised and everyone starts getting heated and everyone's interrupting everyone else. That's where the whole raising the hand thing is. Or, for example, letting people know if they're interrupting you, don't interrupt me, but you also don't want to do the same of cutting others off. If you ask people, don't interrupt me, don't cut someone else off. One more important thing, this one's more simple, but don't make people sick. And this is something we don't always think about, which is, for example, if I'm showing something on the screen, center it on the screen. Center what's most important. If it fits, it sits. Just let it stay. Don't move around. Don't fidget, because especially with designers, I'm sure some of you developers have seen that happen. Is like we show a thing and then we're like fidgeting, trying to get the thing just right, just in frame, kind of like if we have a painting on the wall and we're trying to get it just straightened out. That's very annoying, and it can also make people sick. So stop. And the other thing is, if you have comparisons, just put them there and stay there and just stop moving around. If you can fit 2 things on the screen, left and right, just leave them there instead of jumping from one to the other, to the other, to the other. Just leave them. The other thing that's important, the cursor is your friend. And by that, I mean use the cursor to highlight things. So if you have a cursor and you're like, oh, I want to highlight something, highlight it, but then stop, because the worst thing you can do is jiggling your mouse around and moving it all the time and distracting people, because there's like a fly, or a mosquito around the room and you're like, what's happening? What's going on? And the other thing is, you don't want to be using the mouse as an extension of your hand gestures, which is why it's good to turn on the camera, because you can, you're gesturing and people are going to get it, versus trying to do gestures with the mouse, which can be, jarring. And just to drive the point home, don't move. Avoid constant motion. Zooming in and out is a lot better than, dragging everything around. But even zooming in and out, if you do it in steps, is a lot smoother than trying to do like a smooth scroll, because it looks nice, but on streaming, it looks terrible and choppy, and it can get people motion sick. And the other very important thing is learn your shortcuts for things, because shortcuts are going to help you get to where you need to faster, to zoom in, to zoom out, to go to one place to the next, instead of, having to do it all by hand. And lastly, be yourself. Turn on the camera like I did, because, and especially that's something that we don't do a lot, but it makes meetings more personable if you turn on your camera, if people can see you, because they can see whether you're angry, whether you're mad. A lot of times, especially with text, people aren't sure, like, oh, that kind of sounds like a mean comment. But if you can read someone's body language, you can be like, oh, actually, that person's super calm. So, that message isn't being meant as an insult or something mean. Be mindful of your body language, because you can, if turning cameras on does humanize things, but sometimes you forget the camera can be on. And then if your body language is like you're rolling your eyes at someone, or you're getting mad, or, those kinds of things, you got to be careful with that as well, especially when you have one of those meetings with cameras on. The other thing that's important, which I've been trying to be doing, is make eye contact, which is kind of awkward because you're not actually making eye contact, but it's important in the sense of, like, if someone's looking at your stream and you're kind of looking at them, that's a little more human than someone that's always like, avoiding your gaze, because in person, that's kind of weird. Same thing in virtual things. If you never look at the camera, it's like you're always distracted, it can seem like. And when you're looking at the camera, you're like, okay, the person is focused. That's what eye contact means. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was avoid the reading voice. When you're reading a presentation, which is why hopefully you notice my presentation only has bullet points and not like all of this wall of text that I've been saying out loud. A lot of people go into a reading voice, and reading voice kills your presentation. It's tedious, it's boring, and people know that you're reading, and then people are like, it can kill a presentation real quick, so try to avoid that. And the last thing is good manners. Please goes a long way. Like I said earlier with the getting mad thing, just try to be nice. Remember what your parents taught you.